The land before the takeover imagines standing on a continent where every horizon tells a different story. Towering mountains slice through the clouds, endless forests stretch beyond sight, and rivers carve their way through valleys older than memory itself. For thousands of years, this land wasn't just a backdrop, it was home. From the icy northern coasts to the sun-baked deserts, hundreds of nations thrived here, each with their own languages, traditions, and histories. Every inch of soil held meaning, every river had a name, and every mountain was woven into the stories passed down through generations. But then, everything changed. One day, strange ships appeared on the horizon, carrying people with unfamiliar faces and foreign ambitions. These newcomers didn't just bring new tools or ideas, they brought a hunger for land that would reshape the continent forever. The people who had called this place home for millennia suddenly found themselves facing a force unlike anything they'd ever seen. What followed wasn't just a clash of cultures. It was the beginning of a struggle for survival, identity, and justice. The land that had always been theirs was about to become the most contested prize in a game they never agreed to play. And as the first deals were struck and the first promises made, a dark new chapter in history was about to unfold. But the real story of how this land was taken is far more complicated and far more shocking than most people realize. And it all started with a single, world-changing deal, the Louisiana Purchase, a deal built on a lie in the spring of 1803. Two American politicians found themselves in the heart of Paris, negotiating what would become one of the most famous real estate deals in history. With a single signature, the United States claimed to double its size, acquiring a vast stretch of land for just $15 million, a price so low it seemed almost unbelievable. The world would come to know this as the Louisiana Purchase, a moment often celebrated as a masterstroke of diplomacy and vision. But beneath the surface, the truth was far murkier. What exactly did the United States buy from France? The answer isn't as simple as the textbooks make it sound. France, in reality, didn't truly own the land it was selling. The so-called purchase was little more than a transfer of imperial rights, in agreement that France would step aside and let the young American nation expand westward without interference. The real owners, the people who had lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years, were never consulted. Their voices were ignored, their rights dismissed as irrelevant. This wasn't just a technicality, it was the foundation for a century of broken promises and escalating conflict. The ink on the Louisiana Purchase was barely dry before American leaders realized that their new territory was already home to countless their own laws, and their own deep connection to the land. The United States hadn't bought empty wilderness, it had bought the right to try and take it from those who were already there. And so, the stage was set for a new kind of conquest, one that would be waged not just with armies, but with treaties, negotiations, and a relentless push for expansion. The paperwork might have looked official, but the reality on the ground was about to get far more complicated. And as the United States set its sights on the West, the question of who truly owned the land would become the most explosive issue of all. But the paperwork was just the beginning. Promises of justice, the facade of fairness. In the early days of the United States, its leaders were eager to set themselves apart from the old European empires they'd just broken away from. They spoke of justice, humanity, and a new way of dealing with the people whose land they now coveted. George Washington himself declared that the government's dealings with native nations would be guided by the great principles of justice and humanity. On paper, it sounded like a promise to do things differently, commitment to fairness in a world that had rarely seen it. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Instead of waging endless wars of conquest, the United States would negotiate with native nations as equals. Treaties would be signed, payments would be made, and land would change hands through mutual agreement. The founding documents of the country, filled with words like liberty, welfare, and tranquility, seemed to guarantee that this new nation would live up to its ideals. For a brief moment, it looked like the United States might actually keep its word. But behind the scenes, the reality was already starting to unravel. The hunger for land was insatiable, and the population of the young country was booming. Settlers poured westward, eager for new opportunities and fresh soil. The government, under pressure to deliver, began to see the treaties not as sacred agreements, but as obstacles to be overcome. The lofty language of justice and humanity quickly gave way to impatience and ambition. For many native nations, the negotiations felt less like a fair exchange and more like a forced surrender. Offers of food, farming, equipment, or cash were dangled in front of them. But the price was always the same: their ancestral homelands. Some tribes refused to leave, unwilling to trade centuries of tradition for a handful of goods. Others tried to hold out, hoping the promises of justice would be honored. But as the pressure mounted, it became clear that the ideals written on parchment were no match for the relentless drive to expand. The United States had set the stage with grand promises, but the cracks in the facade were already showing, and as the nation's appetite for land grew, those cracks would soon become impossible to ignore. The next chapter would reveal just how far the government was willing to go to get what it wanted. Broken treaties and dirty tricks as the United States pushed further into new territory, the promises of justice and fair negotiation quickly faded into the background. What replaced them was a relentless campaign of pressure, deception, and outright force. For many native nations, the so-called treaties were little more than traps, documents signed under duress, or worse, forged by people who had no right to speak for their communities. The government's appetite for land was insatiable, and the methods used to satisfy it grew more ruthless with every passing year. Some of the tactics used to secure land were almost unbelievable in their audacity. There are stories of tribal leaders being plied with alcohol until they could barely stand, then coaxed into signing away vast territories they had sworn to protect. In other cases, the government would simply appoint new leaders, individuals with no real authority, just to get a signature on a piece of paper. These signatures, no matter how dubious, were treated as binding contracts, giving the United States the legal cover it needed to claim ownership. When negotiation and trickery failed, the government didn't hesitate to use force. Tribes that refused to give up their land found themselves facing the full might of the U.S. military. In the north, nations near the Great Lakes drew a line in the sand, declaring that a certain river would be the border settlers could not cross. The United States ignored the warning, sparking a series of brutal conflicts. Even after losing battles, the government kept coming back, determined to wear down any resistance. Eventually, after repeated wars and mounting casualties, the tribes were forced to sign away nearly all of what is now Ohio. The same pattern played out across the continent. In the South, the Seminole and Muskogee nations tried to hold on to their land, only to be met with broken promises and military campaigns that left thousands dead or displaced. Even when agreements were reached, they were often violated within a few years, as settlers poured in and the government looked the other way. The paper trail of treaties and payments might have looked official, but on the ground, it was a different story, one of betrayal, manipulation, and violence. And yet, the cycle continued. Every time a new resource was discovered, gold, fertile farmland, or anything else of value, the boundaries would shift. The treaties would be ignored, and the process would start all over again. The facade of justice was wearing thin, and the true cost of expansion was becoming impossible to hide. But the betrayals only got bolder. The Cotton Empire and the 5 civilized tribes. As the United States expanded, a new force began to shape the fate of entire nations. Cotton. In the Deep South, the land was perfect for growing this lucrative crop, and the global demand for cotton was exploding. Southern planters saw an opportunity to build vast fortunes. But there was one problem: the best land was still controlled by native nations. These were not just any nations, but the so-called 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. These tribes had adapted in ways that surprised many outsiders. They built schools, adopted written languages, practiced European-style farming, and even wore Western clothing. Some, in a tragic twist, had even adopted the practice of slavery, hoping that assimilation would secure their place on their ancestral lands. For a time, it seemed to work. The United States signed treaties with these tribes, formally recognizing their rights to their territories. Many believed that coexistence was possible, that the promises of justice and mutual respect could hold. But the hunger for cotton and the wealth it brought proved too powerful. Southern states, especially Georgia, began to see the native presence as an obstacle to their ambitions. The state government passed laws to abolish tribal governments and strip away native rights, openly declaring their intent to replace all of the red with white population. The Cherokee, refusing to be pushed aside, took their fight to the highest court in the land. In a stunning victory, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, affirming their sovereignty and their right to remain on their land. For a brief moment, it looked like justice might actually prevail, but the victory was short. The president at the time, Andrew Jackson, had no intention of honoring the court's decision. He famously scoffed at the ruling, daring the Supreme Court to enforce a challenge he knew they couldn't meet. Jackson's defiance sent a clear message. The law would not protect Native nations if it stood in the way of American expansion. The Cotton Empire was rising, and nothing, not treaties, not court rulings, not even the Constitution would be allowed to stop it. The 5 civilized tribes, who had done everything they could to adapt and coexist, now found themselves targeted by a government determined to erase them from the land, and with one sweeping law, the entire game would change. The Indian Removal Act, legalizing dispossession with the stroke of a pen in 1830, President Andrew Jackson set in motion one of the most devastating policies in American history, the Indian Removal Act. On the surface, the law was dressed up in the language of fairness and voluntary exchange. It promised that Native nations could choose to exchange their homelands for new territory further west. The so-called negotiations were anything but voluntary, and the guarantees were nothing more than empty promises. The government ramped up its efforts to clear Native nations from the South, focusing especially on the 5 civilized tribes whose lands were now seen as the key to the Cotton Empire. Officials arrived with bribes, threats, and more of those infamous treaties, often signed by people who had no real authority to speak for their nations. When persuasion failed, the threat of violence loomed large. The message was clear: leave peacefully, or be forced out. The charade of justice continued, with mountains of paperwork and official-looking documents meant to reassure the public that everything was above board. But for the people on the ground, the truth was impossible to ignore. Families were uprooted from the only homes they had ever known, forced to abandon sacred sites, burial grounds, and the land that held their history. The government's promise that they would never be disturbed again in their new territory was broken almost as soon as it was made. Settlers and speculators followed close behind, eager to claim the newly available land. The Indian Removal Act didn't just legalize dispossession, it normalized it. It gave the government a blueprint for how to take what it wanted, all while maintaining the appearance of legality and order. The law was supposed to be about peaceful relocation, but in practice, it unleashed a wave of suffering and loss that would haunt generations. The 5 civilized tribes, who had tried so hard to adapt and coexist, were now being herded westward, their fates sealed by signatures on a page. And as the forced migrations began, the true horror of the policy would become clear. The next chapter in this story would be written not in ink, but in tears, as entire nations were marched from their homelands into the unknown. And then came the darkest journey, the Trail of Tears. A nation uprooted. What followed the signing of the Indian Removal Act was a tragedy so immense, its echoes are still felt today. Between 1831 and 1838, nearly every member of the 5 civilized tribes was forced to leave their ancestral lands. Over 100,000 men, women, and children, some elderly, some newborn, were rounded up, often at gunpoint, and made to walk more than 1,000 miles toward a place they had never seen. The journey was brutal. People trudged through freezing winters, scorching summers, and endless mud, with little food or shelter. Disease swept through the camps, and exhaustion claimed lives by the day. For many, the only thing heavier than the physical burden was the heartbreak of leaving behind everything they had ever known. The government called it relocation. The Cherokee called it Untold, the trail where we cried. History would remember it as the Trail of Tears. The process was as cold and bureaucratic as it was cruel. Officials checked names off lists, counted heads, and kept meticulous records, as if the suffering could be measured in numbers and signatures. But the real cost was far greater. Families were torn apart, elders died along the way, and children were buried in unmarked graves beside the road. Some estimates say 3,000 people died. Others claim the number was closer to 15,000. But no statistic can capture the loss of culture, language, and spirit that was carried away with every step. Even the so-called treaties that justified this forced march were riddled with fraud. In the case of the Cherokee, the final agreement was signed by a small group with no real authority. While the true leaders protested in vain, the U.S. government didn't care. They had their paperwork, and that was all that mattered. As soon as the land was cleared, white settlers and cotton farmers moved in, building new fortunes on the ruins of entire nations. The Trail of Tears wasn't just a single event, it was the culmination of years of broken promises, greed, and calculated cruelty. It was a turning point that revealed the true cost of America's expansion, not just in land, but in lives and legacies lost forever. And while the settlers celebrated their new prosperity, the consequences of this forced migration would ripple far beyond the borders of the United States, shaping the course of history in ways few could have imagined. But the consequences would echo far beyond America. Legacy and global impact, lessons unlearned. The story of America's westward expansion didn't just end with the last forced march or the final signature on a treaty. The legacy of these actions would ripple outward, shaping not only the future of the continent but also the world's understanding of power, law, and human rights. What made this chapter of history so chilling wasn't just the violence or the suffering, it was the cold, systematic way it was carried out. Was documented, justified, and enshrined in law. There were receipts, ledgers, and treaties on entire bureaucracy built to make dispossession look like progress. This wasn't just a story of broken promises, it was a blueprint for how a nation could use paperwork and legal language to mask injustice. The United States, in its quest to be different from the old European empires, ended up perfecting a new kind of conquest, one that hid behind the facade of treaties and official documents. The world was watching, and the lessons learned here would not be forgotten. In a shocking twist, even some of history's darkest figures took note. It's been said that Adolf Hitler, while planning his own campaign of ethnic cleansing, looked to America's treatment of native nations as a model. He reportedly referenced the forced migrations and the idea of using law to legitimize mass displacement, calling the Mississippi River our Volga and imagining a Europe remade in the image of America's so-called land of opportunity. But the impact didn't stop with dictators and despots. The dispossession of native nations set a precedent for how powerful countries could justify taking what they wanted, as long as they had the right paperwork. It sent the message that treaties could be broken, promises ignored, and entire peoples erased from their homelands, all in the name of progress. The echoes of these actions can still be heard today in debates over land, sovereignty, and justice. Yet, for all the suffering and loss, the story didn't end with defeat. The nations that survived the Trail of Tears and the generations that followed would continue to fight for recognition, rights, and a place in the story of America. And what happened next would surprise the world. Conclusion: the unfinished story, the story of America's expansion, is often told as a tale of bravery, ambition, and the pursuit of a dream. But beneath the surface, it's a story of broken promises, shattered communities, and a legacy that still shapes the nation today. The land that was once home to hundreds of nations became the stage for a relentless campaign of dispossession, all cloaked in the language of justice and progress. Treaties were signed and then ignored, laws were written and then broken, and the ideals that filled the country's founding documents were set aside whenever they became inconvenient. Yet, the consequences of these actions didn't simply fade into history. The forced removals, the betrayals, and the violence left scars that run deep, scars that are still felt by the descendants of those who walked the Trail of Tears, and by a country still grappling with its past. The paper trail of treaties and agreements may have given the appearance of order, but the reality was chaos and loss for those who were pushed aside. The echoes of these events can be heard in today's debates over land rights. But perhaps the most haunting question is this: what would America look like if those promises had been honored? If the ideals of justice and humanity had truly guided the nation's actions, could there have been a different path, one where coexistence and respect replaced conquest and betrayal? It's a question that lingers, challenging us to rethink the stories we tell about our past and the values we claim to uphold. The story of the first Americans is far from over. Their resilience, their fight for recognition, and their determination to reclaim their place in history continue to shape the country's future. As we look back on this dark chapter, we're reminded that history isn't just about what happened, it's about what could have been, and what still might be possible. The unfinished story of America's stolen land is a call to remember, to reflect, and to imagine a future where justice is more than just a word on a page. And as the next chapter unfolds, one thing is certain: the truth will not be forgotten,